Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned actually to the panel before, I've mentioned that all roads lead to Rome. And well, I guess today's event is evidence of that. So today we're talking about something I think very important that links together the Middle East, but also the wider kind of Euro-Mediterranean, Middle East, all the way to the Gulf. In this time of great crisis. Of course, this is our fifth webinar in the series Coping with Coronavirus, but it's the first one that we're doing together with the NATO Defense College Foundation here in Rome. So I would like first and foremost to extend a deep thanks to the NATO Defense College Foundation for working together with us on this event. I think that given the experience and the expertise of the panel, that both the friends that we have together on the panel, but also those who will be in the audience with us, will benefit quite a lot from the discussion about what's going to be happening next in the Middle East after coronavirus. Of course, in order for us to get after coronavirus, we need to have an after coronavirus. From the view from Rome right now remains very bleak. We're hoping still, fingers crossed, for a 3rd May opening, at least a slow opening of the restrictions that are placed because of coronavirus. But still, as scholars and as thinkers, we have to look beyond the immediacy of this crisis, see what's going to come next. And so joining us today, it's truly an international panel. We have Lina Aburuz. She's based in Brussels for the organization Eurofex. And so we're very happy to have you here, Lina. Oded Eran for the Institute of National Security Studies in Israel. Mr. Thank you with us. Umberto Profazio is coming from London, but he's representing the NATO Defense College Foundation. Umberto, welcome. And finally, last but not least, of course, Ahmed Al-Baz for the Early Warning Center in the United Arab Emirates. Ahmed, also, we welcome you. The way that today's session will work is each of the panelists will go through 5-8 minutes to give an overall view of their perspective on what's coming next. Then I, as moderator, will ask several questions, and then we'll open the floor to the audience. Please, for those who are interested in asking a question, our panelists will be very happy to answer them. However, we will ask you, please, to leave it in the Q&A box rather than on the chat screen. So please put all your questions in the Q&A and scan things that are being added. We don't have a replication, and you can also upvote some of the questions that you find relevant so that we will ask them. I will read the questions out so you don't have to worry, and I will put the name of the person as well so that we know who's presenting the question. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Lina in Brussels. Lina,
good morning,
the floor is yours.
Everyone, and thank you so much, Mitchell, for this invitation, and thank you for the NATO Foundation as well for co-organizing it with you. It's such a delight and pleasure to be with such an esteemed group of panelists. And thank God we are all safe and sound and healthy. So let's say that maybe we can beat this unfortunate moment the world is living. The view from Brussels, as you can imagine, it's as gloomy as it could be in any other part of the world, and of course in Brussels here is the capital of Europe. Lots of meetings and lots of publications and lots of events taking place, whether in Brussels or in the member states, on how Europe responds to this unprecedented situation the world is living. From what I can see and how it will be impacting the Middle East, a region where I come from and where I grew up and where I still work closely with a number of countries and governments there. It's very important to highlight that we will go back, I'm sure, alive, hopefully, and to the work, but it's going to be a different world and a different Middle East and a different Europe as well. The globalization that we are living, it could be questioned, and we will have a different sort of deglobalized world. In where I'm mostly worried of for the region is how would Europe and the international community be working with the region after this pandemic and after the recovery. Are there going to be any cuts in terms of assistance, in terms of development and aid? Will there be any cuts as well in military assistance? It's a region that is, I mean, conflicts all around the borders. So how would Europe and the international community be responding? And the third is the unemployment rate that will definitely increase due to the less and less investments and less job opportunities in the region that is already suffering from an unemployment rate amongst the highest worldwide. These are three points that really gets in my head, and possibly what could be the certain countries, how we would deal with the let's say regimes and systems that they are living. I'm talking on a regional level out of assistance from Gulf states. These are as well of course, I'm referring to countries after this. This is from Europe. We are seeing still a fragmented response. Still, there is a fragmentation among the member states on how even they want to aid and help each other. So I do believe it's too early as well to predict how would be the Euro-Med or the Euro-Arab relationship formed after the pandemic. On another aspect as well, I do hope that there will be a moment where we will question institutional reforms in certain countries. Is it and the trust between the citizens and the institutions? It's going to take a totally different form, and as well some institutions like the Arab League. What is its role? What is its input so far? That they do any kind of a regional coordination or any kind of an input? So far, it's a question mark on this body. But my thoughts are some of socio-economic, political, and of course too early to predict, I think, for all of us.
Thank you very much, Lina, for those introductory remarks. I will turn the floor for now to Iran.
Thank you very much. I would like to open by sending condolences to all those who inflicted in Italy, but in other countries as well. And on the other hand, best wishes for a brighter future. And also to the Muslim participants on the panel and to the audience and those in the audience, I would like to say Ramadan Kareem, because this the end of the week we start with the Ramadan. I think that Lina covered most of the points, but I would like to emphasize several points. One, there is a bleak economic forecast. If you read the IMF, the World Bank forecast, it's -0 growth, -4 growth this year. And for certain countries, it's even worse. Take Lebanon, 12% minus growth, and negative growth. So this is, and this comes after a decade of what is called the Arab Spring, which caused economic, political, social problems in the region. So that the double effect of both the Corona and the Arab Spring will linger with us for quite a long time. I think that poor groups and segments of the population in the region will be harder inflicted than the other groups, but it will be a cross-society effect. Then we have to, I don't know whether Lina wanted to speak about this when she spoke about institutions, but the regimes in certain countries, including in my country, they stopped all public religious activities, and that may cause unrest in the longer run if it's not freed. If the activity, religious activity, doesn't go back to normal. The combination of the economic and the religious, and then the role of the army in all of the region, Middle East region countries, the army played a very major role, a positive role, but there was an accumulation of the army playing the role, and secondly, the emergency rules and laws which were applied by all the countries in the region, including mine. And so the question will be how long this will apply and how long it will take to go back to the normal situation before. All the ingredients that both Lina and myself numbered, that may cause or create a fertile ground for call it terrorism, call it extremism, call it whatever you want, but that there is a danger of economic unrest, social unrest, and then religious unrest in the region. I go back to the point of what is to be done by the international community in this situation. And here I also have a bleak forecast, because when you look at Europe, the difficulty in getting the financial resources to assist European countries, especially those affected by the corona and the economic implications. There was a serious battle in Brussels concerning what is called Eurobond. What it means, Europe will be hard, it will find it hard to mobilize funds for outside Europe in order to assist countries that are already in an economic crisis. The same, I think, may apply to international financial organizations, although there was a major effort by the IMF, World Bank, and this is all very positive. How long it can last, good question. And a point which was not made yet this morning, the falling price of the oil is going to be a major factor. Countries which built on a $60 per barrel have to contend now with somewhere between $20, $25 a barrel, and this is a serious trouble, not only for the producing countries, but those who were helped through remittances from foreign workers, Jordan, Egypt, Egyptians and Jordanians, Palestinians who worked in the Gulf and who will not be able to go back to their places of work. And so there is a serious problem where we can start thinking positively is about sharing the experiences. The military, which played a very important role in Jordan, Egypt, Israel, we can use that to create an exchange of information, studying the lessons learned and what can be done in the future. Let me remind you that this was an easy crisis, easy in the sense no systems, no water, no electricity, no communication were hit. The food supply continued in every country in the region. But in a worse scenario, these systems or the EU / NATO can be very important in this respect, giving the umbrella for a cooperation between the countries, since there is already a med dialogue in the context of NATO, and the same can be done by the EU about regional cooperation, economic and otherwise, in order to try and mitigate with the implications of this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your insights. Umberto, let's take a trip to North Africa.
Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you so much for the invitation. I listened very carefully to what Lina and Dad were saying, and I have to say I agree with most of the points raised by them. We must remember that potentially coronavirus represents what can be a watershed moment in contemporary history, uniting the global North and global South in the multifaceted challenge of the pandemic that is causing a havoc and raising doubts about the ruling neoliberal model. The reinforcement of the powers of the state on one side and the shrinking space for civil liberties and, in a certain case, political rights is undoubtedly one of the two major consequences of the spread of the pandemic. And I think it's naive not to think that lockdown measures do not carry the risk of a shift in the relations between the authorities and the public, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. In North Africa, in particular, states are at high risk due to the fact that there's been a prevailing authoritarian model, significant economic constraints, and popular pressure. This authoritarian model has prevailed since the end of the Arab Spring, with the considerable exception of Tunisia, when elites were able to present their fight for survival as an unescapable trade-off between democracy and terrorism. I think that it is highly likely that the pandemic would reinforce this authoritarian trend that leads to the preservation of the regional order, or we might say disorder, but at the same time discredited institutions would be increasingly scrutinized by a disenfranchised population, and this could lead in the long run to a new wave of mass protests. This is an apparent paradox that we can understand if we adopt a dynamic approach that distinguish between the short-term consequences of the pandemic and the long-term effects. Algeria, for example, is the perfect example to understand how these two opposite trends would shape the outcome out of the COVID-19 pandemic, because there authorities have used the pandemic to crack down on protesters and curtail press freedom. The president, the newly elected president, Tebboune, explicitly said that the restrictions on civil liberties is a distinct possibility, and the arrests of opposition activists and journalists have intensified since the spread of the pandemic. The authorities have also suspended access to several news websites in recent weeks. From an international perspective, I think that the pandemic is paving the way for major inroads in the region, in North Africa, by third parties such as China, for example. Beijing has sent ventilators, personal protective equipment, and has also offered to build 2 hospitals in Algeria and Tunisia. It is part of a mask diplomacy, what has been described as a mask diplomacy to increase its soft power in the region. And it's interesting to know that this powerful propaganda machine, to which also Western states like Italy were not able to resist, would lead to a buy-in from member states from states in North Africa through this expanding influence of China along the Belt and Road Initiative, where North Africa represents the soft underbelly, where different international powers like Russia, but also regional players like Turkey are projecting their influence, as we can see in the conflict in Libya, with a significant exception of Libya, which deserve a specific focus due to the fact that the conflict there has been largely indifferent to the pandemic. I think that anyway, the internal factors would be more important than the geopolitical ambitions to shape the Middle East and North Africa after the pandemic. There is a larger role of the state that could reinforce authoritarian trends, and at the same time, it remains to be seen once the pandemic is over, if the states would voluntarily relinquish their powers that have been added during the pandemic. In this case, the case of Tunisia is noteworthy, because the parliament activated the constitutional article 70 of the constitution to give the government special powers to rule by decree, but only for 2 months and only on specific matters. Tunisia represents a significant exception, not only in the region, but also for other states. We can, for example, mention the case of Hungary in Europe. But also Tunisia cannot escape the economic shock to which the panelists were referring to previously. There's been economic plans presented by Tunisia and Morocco, and there's been a significant role for international organizations like the IMF and also the Islamic Development Bank in the case of Tunisia. But this money will come with strings attached, because they imply significant reforms to adjust macroeconomic policies in the long run. This would be probably met with the significant opposition by the population due to the increasing unemployment rate. And we also have to add to this the fact that the oil slump for oil-producing countries is worrisome. We can think also about Algeria again, because financing internally the debt has led the country to deplete its foreign exchange reserve, that have been for the first time under $60 billion. I think that in conclusion, social tensions are likely to increase in the long run, and the mismanagement of the pandemic, but also the high toll, the misinformation, and the efforts of the authorities to conceal the real dimension of the pandemic would lead to a new wave of mass protests after 2019, where we've seen mass demonstrations in Algeria, but also some protests in Egypt and in 2011. This face-off is highly likely, and it will be met by an increasing securitization and militarizations of the state. That is a global trend that involves not only North Africa, but also the Western world.
Thank you so much, Umberto, for that overview. We will quickly now turn to Ahmed in the United Arab Emirates, having covered the Middle East intellectual. So please, Ahmed, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Firstly, this is a very hard crisis, and I think for sure it will lead to a very hard time. We cannot ignore that fact or jump on it, because to believe in that fact, the first step to deal with the crisis in a very smart way, and this why will make the differences between how every country will deal with the COVID-19 crisis. But the Middle East, the Middle East economy will see a sharp slowdown in 2020, and especially tourism and oil sector. Many countries will start to use their sovereign wealth funds. For sure, this is a time to use it. And many countries will tighten their budget by cutting government spending, like what Bahrain did yesterday, by cutting 30% of government spending. I would like to focus on Gulf as a man in field, and the COVID crisis will affect many countries in the Middle East which receive a financial support from the Gulf, like Lebanon and Jordan. For example, Jordan should receive $100 million yearly since 2019 as a financial grant from Kuwait for the next 5 years. I have doubts that Kuwait will no longer have the ability to pay such amount. So it will be a very hard time for Jordan. But since the crisis started, I was looking for some pride points about it. And one of those pride points was the production system in many countries of the region, especially North Africa, like Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria. I think they will be able to withstand because they are not linked to a global value chains. I know it's not good because it's not good for the economy in a normal situation, but the lack of linkage with value chains currently may be useful in managing the crisis. I would like to go for Iran. The crisis on the religious tourism and poor oil sector. And I think there will be a question will raise up by the people of Iraq and Lebanon about the meaning of sovereignty, because right now Hezbollah still keep borders on between Lebanon and Syria at the time of coronavirus, even if the government decided to shut down the borders. These open borders are very important for Hezbollah business in Lebanon for its trading and support, which is coming from Iran through Syria. And the same happened in Iraq, while the Iranian proxies still controlling on some borders and keep it on ignoring the risk of infection from Iran. I mentioned that because this could fuel the Iraqi and the Lebanese people against Iran later. As a man in the field, the crisis show how many Gulf countries' infrastructures was ready for such a shock. And I can take the UAE as example. The country started to surround the crisis very early. The UAE is highest country around the world doing COVID-19 tests by around 27,795 tests for all the residents until yesterday. The UAE government didn't go away from its responsibilities like some countries did around the world. And this very important point, there's many initiatives to give financial support to the small investors and residents. There are also exemptions from some violations of non-performing loans until further notice. The UAE, as example, the life in UAE is still and will continue to work at a moderate level without noticeable confusions for several notices, including that the UAE has been working for many years to convert towards the digitalizations of most its government and service sectors, and therefore the management of many business and personal life will continue to a reasonable pace. Also, the UAE has a strong health able to withstand, and the country is recording the highest level of screening operation of COVID-19 around the world. The spread of the virus, and such progress would not have been without such a strong health system and organized logistics sector. And this is, I mentioned that it's a very in the area. The UAE has a strong data sector who own the data on the future, since it has long been aware of importance of big data in UAE. And those the state can monitor any health indicators in the population and perform classification process for the elderly, any weak and sick history easily, which contributes to monitoring any residents that may be infected with disease. I mentioned the UAE examples because I would like to add it as a lesson for many countries around in the Middle East, that to have a good health sector and to own big data is a very important thing in the crisis time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your initial remarks. I mean, there's so much food for thought here. The first thing, of course, is that this crisis is not over. We still don't know what the death rate is. We still don't know how long this will, impair our economies, be them nationally, be them regionally, be them internationally. We don't know to what extent there will be, some kind of cure found, in the coming days or coming weeks that will change everything from our analysis today, which is why it's so important for us to do this guesswork, to be mature enough to know if we're wrong, of course. But it's in some ways it's better to have a cautious approach as to what the future has in store, rather than to be overly optimistic, especially given. I just received a message now that this week or this past week was the most significant death rate in England and Wales ever, in terms of 1 week of death. I think I guess not ever, but of illness post-war period. I have to look closer at that. But the fact remains that so many questions, there's so much uncertainty. And of course, the COVID crisis has produced an economic crisis, which is coinciding with the oil price issue that's now, yesterday was trading below in the minuses, which of course will have shockwaves. The two are not related, but they play into each other. So it's important that we know those links and we know how they are going to be working with each other. Now, I'm going to turn over, have some questions myself to ask our panelists. I will begin with Lina, because I like this concept that you brought up about deglobalization. I'm just wondering what a deglobalized world looks like. I mean, you have this very unique position, being in Brussels, living in Brussels, working in Brussels, but still coming from the Middle East. You're probably very the right person to ask about what deglobalization means in terms of Middle East-European relations, please.
Thanks, Mitchell. Definitely, it's a moment where, regardless of how much we are investing in technology, in digitalization, in data gathering, in science, in building skyscrapers and smart cities, yet I do believe that this pandemic has really put question mark on how much we are let's say sharing our data, our best practices, let's say, and we are all a small village. It's back in the 90s, we were saying like, oh, the small village is not gonna happen. It's like it's happened, and we are all sharing everything. And you are either with the top-notch big companies and the investors and the international financing institutions are the ones that they set the tone. This shock that took the world by unexpectedly, it really put strong countries, very well prepared countries, countries that they dominate the world, like the US, like the European continent, like on a question how much this kind of ruling and imposing certain things on regions like my region, and even let's say they have exposed for the technology, their culture, their methodologies, and like Latin America, Southeast Asia, let's not forget. It's not only the Middle East is at the whim of this crisis and could be questioned. So this is the word I can see as a word that thinking more inwards and deglobalized. And I'm sorry to say, we can, as two points over here I forgot to mention. We see superpowers like the US is cutting its funding to the World Health Organization. You see as well their commitment to the WTO. So you have the health and you have the trade together on a multinational, on a global level, two very important institutions, especially its role now in this moment, are putting in, immediately the US demonstrated that we are thinking inward and we are ditching the global word and the international institutions. So this is the word that I can imagine afterwards is the legitimacy and the continuity of multinational and international bodies like WHO, United Nations, Arab League on a regional level, and the WTO.
Very, very important insights, and it's a good way for you to kind of push that debate a bit further. I think one of the points that we're kind of going back and forth to in this so far is that we have very national solutions, national approaches, be it in the UAE. Bahrain, for example, has developed its national approaches. Italy, Jordan, Belgium, everything is national. And I will open this up to Oded to carry on the discussion, because that's only one level. Yeah, we see this national, everybody's coming inwards, they're looking for solutions at home. But at the same time, lines of communication to the world continue to open. You know, and look what we're doing today using Zoom. Sometimes, you know, with the scientific communities, you see how science is, you know, transcending borders. Now, Oded, my question is, to what extent is this crisis actually producing something positive in terms of person-to-person contact or community, civil society to civil society? I know that you're coming from a very complicated part of a complicated region, and I'm wondering, is there any initiatives in which Israelis and, for example, the Arab neighbors are working and collaborating together to deal with this crisis?
I think we are debating a fascinating question. And I think that we are dealing with two opposite trends. One is the what you call the inward looking, and this was obvious in the treatment or the way countries, states dealt with the issue. Each one of us was unfortunately on its own. We saw even in the EU, within the EU, countries which do not cooperate, although that was against the rules or the four freedoms on which the EU is built. When one country stops the supply of certain medical stuff, important and vital, but stops it, this is against the very philosophy of the EU. And when countries like Italy couldn't get the support, sufficient financial support from the EU, it obviously raises very identity, existential question to what are the limits of an organization which you can say symbolizes globalization, such as the EU. On the other end, I fail to see how the economic recovery of any region, of any state, can be done on a deglobalized economy. We will have to rely on the ability of the countries to trade, the ability of people to work in other countries, because there is, for example, in the Middle East, if Jordanians, Palestinians, Egyptians couldn't work anywhere outside their own countries, where will the income come? This is in certain countries, this is a major factor in the gross domestic product. So I think that these are two opposite trends, and the quicker we come out of this crisis, and the quicker we come out from the mode of self-reliance, because there are no better options, I think this will take us back to the globalized world. And I think that there is no return from globalization. The telecommunication revolution, which is on its way, 5G, the whole question of how we communicate right now in this moment between us is going to stay with us, develop, and there's no going back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Umberto, I agree with everything that you have said. This is a watershed moment. It's a watershed moment regionally. It's a watershed moment globally. It's very reminiscent of the period of the Spanish flu and all the insecurity that brought just over a century ago. My question is, because you raised the issue of mask diplomacy, and of course, mask diplomacy is not only about the masks, but it's about the level of engagement that in the wake of, the level of engagement that the superpowers, the great powers are having in the wake of this crisis. You mentioned China, but you've not mentioned specifically, for example, the role of France or the role of the United States. are they leaving a vacuum in North Africa open to be filled by others?
Yes, I think so. I specifically mentioned China because I think that the inroads made by Beijing in North Africa has been considerable. The fact that they are not only sending medical equipment, medical teams, also they want to build hospitals to treat the rising number of inpatients that are expected in these countries is noteworthy. And we also have to consider that some of these hospitals will not treat only Algerian and Tunisians, because in Algeria, for example, there is a considerable large expat Chinese workers that are working there. So the fact that these instruments have been used as a way to expand the soft power of China and replacing the US hegemony in the region is noteworthy. Also because the US is gradually withdrawing, not only from North Africa and from the Middle East. We have noticed their absence in the Libyan conflict and contradictory remarks about what policy, if there is one, they must follow in Libya. And it's the fact that they are trying to follow what I describe the muscular isolationism of President Trump. The fact that there was mentioned before that we can return probably to globalization after the end of the pandemic. I don't think so. I think that there have been many signs showing that the inward looking is leading to national response, and this could lead in the long run to nationalism. That I think is in apparent contradiction with the globalization. And let me tell you also one thing about the use of technology. It keeps us connecting worldwide, making it like we are still part of a globalized world. But we must not forget that technology is being used by different nations and regimes to increase surveillance on their citizens and to impose lockdown measures that obviously are needed in the time of the pandemic. But my question is, what will happen after? Because these, like China and Russia, for example, shall we behave like them? I mean, in the Western world, shall we follow this model? Because in Italy, for example, increasing amount of people, if you see the polls, that are looking to China as the new ally of Rome, in a certain sense, replacing the US and the EU, as Oded said. The fact that the cry for help of Italy was not followed through will have some serious consequences in the medium, but also in the long run.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Those are very, very important insights. I will turn now, Ahmed, I have a question for you. It's something that the perspective from the UAE, and I believe that it's shared in other places as well, which is security issue. And I think that it's something that should have been obvious or has been obvious in the past. Just to pause on it, just to reflect, I was very surprised at how few countries in Europe had enough masks, enough ventilators, enough rubber gloves. You know, they saw that their stocks were empty and somehow nobody refilled them. And I'm wondering, Ahmed, if you could talk a little bit more about the Gulf in general and about why the Gulf was so quick at being able to identify health as a security issue. And in that way, what kind of lessons can be learned about the securitization of health?
Yeah. The many Gulf countries, and especially the UAE, as I'm there, I'm in the field, as I mentioned, they have a good health sector and they have a good logistics sector, and the crisis shows how the UAE was ready for that, as I mentioned before. The EU has working for many years to convert to digitalizations, and as it's very important, as Lina mentioned, the UAE digitalization most of the government service sectors, and therefore the management of of many business and the personnel will continue to a reasonable pace. And the UAE knows right now how many beds they have in the hospitals, and how many checkers they have in the hospitals, so they know how to use it. And in the UAE also, there's no they go for all their residents. They support all the residents with many initiatives. For example, there was an initiative in the UAE. They collect around 200 million dirhams until yesterday to help the residents. Also, the UAE has a strong data sector. As I mentioned, the who own data own the future. Since long time, the UAE was aware of the importance of big data, and this big data can monitor the population performance and the classification process for the early, and the country right now know who is have a weakness health, and who have a high immunity and down immunity, and which contributes to monitor the residents that may be infected with disease. Auto medical insurance in the UAE in the time of COVID-19, because the government announced that if you're affected by the virus, you can recover for free on behalf of the country. The USA cannot do that. There's many Americans stay abroad. They are thinking that they are safe abroad because they don't like to go back to the US. They will pay a lot of money for the insurance. In the UAE, they have a very impressive insurance sector. So everything is going on the right way, and there's no afraid through the residents, because they are knows that the country takes the responsibility to support them.
Thank you very much. Actually, we've seen that also in Saudi, and actually in all the Gulf countries, in Kuwait, in Bahrain. We've seen all of they opened up, and what's interesting, I noticed, is that they opened up not only to nationals, but to foreigners, and even to illegal people who are living in the land. Basically, no questions asked, because they viewed it as this health crisis. Of course, there are lessons to be learned. The United States right now is going through a tremendously difficult period, I think, with the tensions that have arisen internally because of those disparities. But we won't have, I think, the time or scope to go into the United States and COVID. But what we will do now is, I see that the number of questions is just piling up. I always like this. We have about a half an hour. I will go through them as much as and as best as I can, and I do apologize if at the end of half an hour we don't have all the answers answered. For the audience that's listening, if we don't get to you, please feel free to email us and we will forward your question to the panelists to get you the answers that you're looking for. I will start actually with His Excellency, the Ambassador of Jordan to Italy, Ambassador Khoury, whose question just vanished, actually. So I will look for it. It literally was there 1 second ago, but it seems to have, oh, there it is. So Ambassador Khoury is asking, will the COVID-19 crisis encourage regional players to work together? The only way to beat the crisis and end the future cycles is for neighbors to work together. Would that become a lever for a new structure of regional cooperation in political, economic, scientific, and all other domains? So this is a general question about how there can be an evolution of cooperation as a result of this crisis. Anybody want to jump in first? You can just... Okay, so first Oded, and then we will answer with Lina. You seem still to be on mute.
It's a pleasure to answer a question from a Jordanian colleague. As a former ambassador of Israel to Jordan, it's a double pleasure. Secondly, I think that the crisis is could be a jumping board for regional cooperation in many areas which are less developed now, but could be much more developed. For example, water. The water issue was highlighted in this respect, not only because this crisis, not only because the major recommendation was to wash our hands every minute, but because the role of, for example, of agriculture was highlighted in the question of self-sufficiency. We, for example, we had to, it's funny, but we had to import eggs from Italy because there was a shortage for one reason or for another. I think that basically the crisis highlighted the role of agriculture, as well as in Jordan, by the way, but also in Israel. And certainly we know the problem in Syria, which is already much deeper because of the crisis in Syria beyond the corona. I think that certainly in the area of health, because there is movement, for example, between Palestine and Jordan, students are going back and forth between Israel and the Palestinian territories, both Gaza and the West Bank. There are 125,000 Palestinian workers in Israel, not right now, but in regular times. And so there will be a need, at least on these issues. You can say, fortunately or unfortunately, most of the cooperation between countries in the region, our mini region, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, was conducted through the security apparatus. And I think that for the time being, I would be happy to see this method or channel used, but for civilian purposes, certainly in health, and we can develop the cooperation in other fields and disciplines also beyond the military channel. I come back to the point which I raised before because I hope that my colleague, Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, is listening to this program. But if he is, there is a point that we can drive with NATO in this respect. Not only NATO, the EU, unfortunately, is now absorbed in itself, dealing with its own problems. But the EU can play and NATO can play a major role in supplying the coverage, supplying the leadership for the regional cooperation. It's not only about money, it's about supplying leadership, coverage, political coverage, economic coverage, and an umbrella to the countries in the region to develop this regional cooperation, even in the absence of diplomatic channels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lina?
Of course, just adding a couple of points here. It's a crisis, and it's extremely very early to know if there will be any changes in the DNA of the region. It's very early to see if we have got any lessons learned on a humanitarian level. Yet we can see that there are emerging countries and emerging leaders that their rapprochement, or let's say the closeness and the bonding between them and their people is getting stronger and stronger, and there is no way that such countries cannot live up to the humanitarian level. So we push for them, all the push from the international community, and of course here I'm referring to a country like my own country, Jordan, that is really managed this crisis in the most professional manner, and it's a worldwide endorsement we're getting. And in order for the region to learn from this best practices that Jordan has done, is a change in the will and the approach of the other leaders and systems in the region in order to open up and save many and many from this crisis.
Yes, please, Odette.
I want to add one element to the subjects or issues on which we can cooperate. And this is very important to the Egyptians, Jordanians, Israelis, and Palestinians, and this is tourism. Tourism is probably one of the most hard-hit sectors of the economies, and it will take it the longest time to recover because many people will think several times before they board a plane, before they go on a ship to visit other countries away from their homes. A regional cooperation to facilitate the movement, to make the movement safe and easy for external tourists from outside the region may encourage, but we need to increase the cooperation in this respect between the governments, because there will be competition between regions. Middle East is not the only attractive area for tourists, and there will be competition. And the better and the faster we organize ourselves, we may help our economies to come out from this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will turn to the next question. It's a general question, but it's focused on, in terms of this is from Tommaso Furio Clerici. He's asking, Many of you advocated the role of the EU as a possible enabler, facilitator for future cooperation in the Middle East. What could be, in concrete terms, the role of the EU to perform such a role? So in other words, what role specifically can the EU play in relation to the Middle East as a facilitator, as an enabler in terms of cooperation in the Middle East?
Mitchell, it's an excellent question, because for years and years and years, since the EU is built their assistance and their diplomacy on a set of values. So any work and any cooperation should be given to the countries, and as long as they abide and they adopt, or let's say enhance the values that they have and be inspired by how Europe functions. I think it could have a very interesting role in the future, given that in times of the crisis, these values were not implemented within Europe, as just Ambassador Oded said. It's Europe itself in crisis, and within the member states they cannot agree. We have seen what happened towards Italy a few weeks ago. Yet Europe always stands up and goes on stronger and stronger. I do hope that they will take the time during this period is to rethink their cooperation and their collaboration mechanisms and tools and conditions with the world, and especially when we still have, of course, the refugee crisis or the migration crisis. Europe did not always implement its own values. So if Europe has to have this role in the future, and I'm certain that it will, because it's the center of the of the whole world, I believe, Europe, it has to re-examine its approach first.
Would somebody else like to jump in and add something? Sure, please. Ambassador and then Umberto.
You meant me? Okay. Let me give you an example. After the Madrid conference in 1991, there were regional 5 groups which were established. One of them was the Economic Regional Development Working Group, which was led by Europe. It was the gavel holder, and all the countries, even before establishing diplomatic relations, were involved, from the Gulf, Egypt, which already had diplomatic relations with Israel, Jordan, not yet, but all of them participated in this group. And Europe gave the leadership. There was no much money involved in that, not at all. The question was giving the political umbrella for that to happen. And I take it as an example, what it takes, as we say, the cliche says, it needs 2 to tango. It needs Europe to emerge from the current shell of dealing with its own problems and looking for initiatives which, as I repeat, do not necessitate necessarily, they don't foreclose, but you don't need money for that. And you can give the leadership, and for what it takes is some of the regional players to agree to participate in such an activity, given that it's been mutually beneficial for all of these countries to participate, because there are economic targets, economic vehicles, which can help the region to extricate itself from some of the current problems.
Thank you very much. Umberto?
Yes, following up on what Lina said about the EU and the fact that it has certain values, but I believe that it has gradually lost its way in the meantime, due to the fact that the treatment of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers has not been to the standard that we were expecting. In this case, I'm particularly talking about the EU policy towards Libya, and the fact that if we talk about the pandemic and what COVID-19, what effect will have on Libya, for example, we said that the conflict seems largely indifferent to that. But if we think about the number of people held in detention centers for migrants in Libya that are in terrific conditions, obviously overcrowded, the impact that the pandemic can have on these people and facilitate the spread of coronavirus in the country is absolutely huge. So Europe, for example, must revise its policy towards Libya, in particular about the direction that has been followed by the new European leaders is this. We must think, for example, about the new EU mission off the coast of Libya that doesn't have any search and rescue task, but is only intended to enforce the arms embargo, not in the entire coastline, but only in the eastern part of the country, of Cyrenaica. So I think that before saying that, I mean, Europe has a huge role to play in this specific issue, but at the same time, it must revise its policy.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Keith Boyfield, who's our own research fellow, and based also in London. He's asking about how far does the panel anticipate that we might witness a wave of takeovers of key assets from overseas investors, particularly Chinese investors in the Gulf. I would like to extend that beyond the Gulf and perhaps to talk about it in your respective regions. This might become a significant trend if asset prices plummets on account of the oil price. Will certain countries be highly resistant to overseas direct investment? So please, I think we can not only deal with this question on the Gulf level, but we can talk about it in Africa, in North Africa, in, well, basically anywhere. So would anybody like to field this? Please, Oded, go ahead.
It's a very interesting question, and it comes on the background of even what happened before the crisis began. I think that the crisis underlines or sharpens the question. First of all, there will be less and less FDIs, foreign investments, direct investments coming to the region, and the region itself will. Good question. If China, which owns in the current situation tremendous financial resources, is willing or interested. Number one, China is in a bit of a problem. You can call it a PR problem, and the Chinese are talking about a decline in GDP, economic growth. I wish the numbers on any of our countries, all the panelists and others, but still, it's in Chinese terms, it's a decline. And they will have also to look inwards in terms of what comes first economically, the rehabilitation of their own economy, or trying to buy assets in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world. So there is a competition in China itself between external and internal. Secondly, I'm not joking when I say China can buy the Lebanese debt tomorrow morning. They can buy the debt and say, it's ours. We will repay all the debts of Lebanon and become the economic masters of Lebanon. The fact is that China has not invested very much, put it more clearly, very little in Syria. They could do the same thing in Syria. They could do it in Lebanon easily. But the question is, the Chinese are working not only with the political ambition, but also in terms of economic value. Is it valuable to the Chinese economy or not? And I think that in Syria, they reached the conclusion that, at least for the time being, they're not going to invest. The same can be said about Lebanon. Now, what are they going to buy when it comes, for example, to the oil industry? Yes, they have strategic interest in buying. For example, if Aramco continues to sell or privatize beyond what they did, Chinese may be interested. But they can get the oil now at low prices without investing necessarily in Aramco or any other oil company. The point that I'm trying to make is that, yes, it looks very attractive, certain assets, but in the time of uncertainty, of you don't know necessarily how certain sectors are going to develop. You can buy now 5-star hotels in Jordan, Israel, Egypt, easily. Are you going to invest in these hotels without knowing what will be the future of the tourism industry? I'm not so sure. So I think that we have to deal with the question of Chinese or any other potential buyers very sophisticated and not just jump to conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lina, I'll come to you in 1 second, but just a note, we have 10 minutes left. So what we'll do is try to work through a lot of these questions. I'll give are you sure? Okay. But I'm sure there'll be opportunity to follow up with that. So we will go as quickly as possible through each. So I'll ask the panel to keep your answers, sharp and let's say 30 seconds to 1 minute. Now I know that's impossible, but one can be hopeful for the future. Anyways, we'll turn now to Nuruddin Hamdi, who's written that the question is about the security implications of COVID crisis on the conflict in Libya, and how the fragile stability and on the fragile stability in the Sahel. Could you please explain what would be those implications and how the European Union and NATO can deal with them? I guess that's a question primarily for Umberto to talk about Libya and the.
Yes, many thanks for the question. I think that in Libya, the spread of the pandemic has been probably underreported due to the fact that the conflict is ongoing, and the international organizations such as the United Nations have called for respecting or enforcing the ceasefire. But at the same time, the clashes have been going on, and we have seen recently a major push by the government of national accords to retake previous positions that were held by the Libyan National Army. I don't think that the COVID-19 is still playing a role on the conflict, but as I said before, is taking a toll on civilians, the civil population, the health facilities that have been targeted in airstrikes and drone strikes around the country, also on the most disadvantaged piece. For the Sahel, that's interesting because I think that the COVID-19 will further weaken states in the region and armed groups and terrorist groups in the region. And so I think that this balance will probably go to the advantage of these groups, in particular the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, but also the Islamic State, and would further feed the instability in the region.
Yeah, go ahead, Ahmed, go ahead. You're still on mute.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I want to follow up with Umberto. I think leave of response and to arrange artists, which has become something difficult to achieve completely, which would hinder any projects to manage and end the crisis. In Libya, for example, there are European actors active in Libya, but European efforts will focus on the European interior and the current situation because of Corona crisis. And those external interference will remain filtered in the near and medium future. I think the preoccupation of the international parties in managing their local crisis will cause a lawful and vacuum that the conflict parties in Libya and Syria may benefit from it in order to deepen their control over the areas of influence or jump upon these regions. Consequently, we may see further military escalation by internal parties to seize the opportunity to achieve many gains. As all of us knows that chaos is an environment suitable for guerrilla wars or regular wars, as we mentioned. And that type of wars prevails in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and therefore this situation is beneficial to the military actors in these countries. I think I want to mention it that with the media and political focus on the COVID-19 crisis in every country around the globe, conflict is in many countries in the region will become completely blind for media and for us as monitors, and this very useful for such conflict environment. I think if COVID-19 crisis will not contain in the short and medium term, we may witness a refugee movements, meaning the areas to another areas reside to provide them a responsible level of safety so that they will not be infected by the virus. This will be put a pressure on many countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving right along, there's a question by Jack Morgan Jones. He's asking it specifically to Umberto about the form of long-term unrest in places like Algeria. I'm going to revise it a little bit. Sorry, Jack. This is, moderator's privilege. I'm going to reform it a bit to extend it, because what the basis of the question is actually the rise of nationalistic movements. Whether or not this crisis is going to produce really more nationalism, or in the case of the Middle East, is it going to, create a new driver for pan-Arabism? And I would add to that, so if that's one option, nationalism, the second is pan-Arabism, I would like to extend that even further and talk about, for instance, pan-Islamism or some other panism that may be gripping the Middle East. Maybe we can open this as a panel. What does the future have in store for the Middle East? Are we going to see a trend of hunkering down? Are we going to see a trend of expansion? Let's try to tease this out a bit. Anybody? Any first responders?
This is always ladies first. I'm a prudent or cautious optimist, but I would like to be optimist. It could really evolve this crisis into new dynamics and a different kind of relationship between the institutions, the government, and the citizens, and the fears and the challenges and the, let's say, the hurdles that we're talking about democratic systems, or we're talking about constitutional. It could be as well. It's a moment, like it's a disruptive moment. It's a chaotic moment that can form in new alliances. Humanitarian best practices on education, on technology, for many years. We have been looking into having a sort of a pan or pan region corporation that is beyond the security measures, because it's a region that we've always had conflicts, we've always had issues, we will always have it, I think. But any corporation was made based on a humanitarian or military intervention. So I think it is an opportunity that emerge in having a new alliances that could be not only Gulf, it could be Gulf, Levant, Mashriq, Maghreb, you see. And the second, a different kind of cooperation not based on security and military and threats. And third, it could emerge in new political systems that are more open and less afraid to Islam, let's say, radicalize the groups and foreign.
Wonderful. This question is also kind of turning into the last conclusion as we are ticking away at the time. So Lina, if you'd like to add maybe a final remark, and then we'll kind of take it through the rest of the panel so that we can kind of wrap up the session.
Well, the thing is, one point I'd like to mention is a reputation measure and a communication measure that we will see emerging, and we will see in new countries that they are going to step up to the international arena. We will have a new in new countries that they've been always known for their facilities, services, easy things, easy life, that they will fall. And we will see the amazing classical regions and countries that we've always looked up to as well in a huge question.
Thank you very much.
Okay. We are standing now at a junction. Go inwards, we can go back from globalization. We can go to extremism in the region, whether because of political, economic, religious reasons, or we can say we learn first what was missing. We learn where did we fail. We learn how much we can or cannot rely on external, outside the region resources, and we take it from here, and we try not to forget political problems, but at the same time, forge some regional cooperation which benefits all of us as a group and each one of us individually. I mentioned as of cooperation. What is needed is the highest political echelon to decide. As I said, we don't forget political issues, we don't forget political conflicts, but we want to go ahead with some of our necessities, economic and our society's needs for development.
Thank you very much, Umberto.
Yes, I'll try to briefly address the question on Algeria. As I said before, we have to take into account the short-term effects of the pandemic and the long-term consequences. I think that maybe following the end of the emergency, we have to see, we will see probably it is likely a new face-off between the authorities, the regime, and the demonstrators, the opposition movement known as Iraq. It is difficult to say how this will, before the start of the emergency, the opposition movement was starting to weaken after 1 year of weekly protests that had the merit of ending the regime of Abdelaziz Bouteflika. In general, I recently found an interesting quote from an author that is called Mikkel Bolt Rasmussen. It says that many states, not only in the region, not only in the Middle East and North Africa, but also Western states, are using coronavirus as an instrument to impose a state of emergency. And this will probably, it is interesting because it shows how in the long run, there will probably, it is likely that there will be some kind of face-off between demonstrators due to the economic shock that many of us are experiencing also right now, and the authorities. We need to rethink probably the economic model, but also the way in which the international organizations are working on the pandemic. We've seen how the WHO has managed the start of the pandemic in China, and there have been a lot of questions about the role of the United Nations, not only in this case, but also in other crises and conflicts worldwide.
Thank you very much. Ahmed, your final remarks?
Yeah, I'm there. I want to catch the very famous, popular question raised right that day is about the protests. The crisis will fuel the protests in the street. It's not possible for me to accept that there will be demonstrators or an uprising, as some imagine, because, for example, in Egypt, the relationship is gradually improving between the people and the government. There is feeling inside the Egyptian street right now that the government is doing positive things within the limits of its financial and organizational capabilities, such as granting subsidy to informal employment and amending the progressive tax project in order to provide support to lower income classes due to the economic condition caused by coronavirus. So I think that the coronavirus itself may be the revolution, not lead to a revolution. The coronavirus crisis revealed the dysfunctions and weakness in different sectors of the infrastructure and health sector and unemployment the crisis of informal employment, social inequality, and low wages in a way that pushes people to go to work at the time of the epidemic. What will alert many countries to those serious problems, as there will be a general tendency to build what is known as the real estate, mainly based on caring for the interests of its citizens from a national perspective, not from a tribal or a regional or a sectarian perspective, where the crisis revealed that the disaster affect everyone, and that working on individual islands or in ethnic or sectarian and partisan grounds is not beneficial for the people or for the country.
Thank you very much. Our time has, very rapidly. I think this was a very important discussion to have. It's definitely not the last time we'll be talking about, looking forward into the future of post COVID-19 world. Get the chance to address your questions, but I see that we still have 90 participants, which, for an hour and a half to have reduced and still have 90, it's great. It means that the topic is still so important for people. So first and foremost, I'd like to, virtually thank our speakers and our panel for making the time to be here with us today. I would like very much to thank the NATO Defense College Foundation for your support. This was a great partnership event, and we are very grateful to have them and their support for this event and for others, of course. And finally, just to give you a little bit of info as to the weeks ahead, next week, same time, same place, we're going to be talking about populism, nationalism as it's being affected by COVID-19. And the week after, we're going to have a very specific topic on terrorism, on Daesh, and the way that Daesh is acting and reacting because of COVID-19. So in the weeks ahead, we also look forward to having you with us. And from Rome, we would like to say goodbye, and we wish everybody to be safe, happy, and healthy, and hopefully, inshallah, we get through this, easy from now on. So thank you again.